Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Ramiro from Anti-Conquista. Anti-Conquista is an anti-imperialist media collective. Our content is produced by and for the Latin American and Caribbean diaspora. And today we're talking about Kwame Ture, scientific socialism, and anti-colonialism. And we have our great comrade and friend, Onyesonwu Chatoyer, who is a cadre with the All African People's Revolutionary Party, which is the party that Kwame Ture was actually a leader of, a very important party. Onyesonwu is also the All African Women's Revolutionary Union, an editor with Hood Communists, and a member of the National Organizing Committee for the Venceremos Brigade. How's it going, Onyesonwu?
Glad to be here.
Cool. Well, we were just talking before we started going live about like how unfortunate it is that Kwame Ture is so little known because of racism, not only and also because of his very revolutionary and radical views. I mean, from the white left, he's someone who was demonized as like horrible and anti quote unquote anti-Semitic and he was like too crazy, whatever. But then a lot of people within the Black and brown like civil rights movements were saying like, oh, he's too extreme. I know a few months ago when I forget the civil rights leader. I think it was John Lewis and C.T. Vivian when they passed away. Fucking Bill Clinton. First of all, who the fuck asked Bill Clinton about his opinion? But second of all, he was like, "Oh, it's a good thing we didn't get Stokely Carmichael, which is Kwame Ture. It's a good thing that he didn't stay in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee." And it was just such a fucking disrespect to Kwame, who is such a revolutionary. What does Kwame Ture mean for you and your party and the work that you do?
I feel like, first of all, Bill Clinton's remarks at John Lewis's funeral were a testament to how much of a threat the politics of Kwame Ture and the politics of the All African People's Revolutionary Party remain to this day. Like, he was very clearly saying, like, we prefer the House Negro path. Please don't do the anti-colonial path. Like, he was like, that was like, it was intentional. It was like an attack on our politics because they are still a threat to the empire. So I think that Kwame Ture's analysis, he died over 20 years ago and they're still shook. Kwame Ture's analysis, revolutionary Pan-Africanism, the Crimmins and Tourism are like a weapon against imperialism, against the U.S. empire. And a lot of his analysis to this day, even if it was given in like the 90s or the 80s or the 70s, is still relevant to our conditions. Like, he was so clear and so uncompromising when it came to attacking imperialism and capitalism and colonialism that we can still learn quite a bit from what he said in his analysis.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's funny that you say that because that's so true. Like, whenever Black and brown revolutionaries are in those spaces and they start talking about reparations, Africa for Africans, land back and all that stuff, the white liberals start getting real uncomfortable. They're like, oh, let's taper it down a little bit. And so I feel like, in my opinion, someone like Kwame Ture, like, they're purposely trying to hide who he is, trying to like hide him from the masses because like even the way he spoke, the way he interacted with the youth, like he has so much energy. And I think it's something that is so dangerous for the US ruling class because I think even I was doing some research about him and even in like COINTELPRO, like they were saying like, oh, after Malcolm X, he's going to be like the next quote unquote messiah of the Black liberation movement. And that's something that they were definitely concerned about. And so today we're going to be listening to some excerpts from his speech in 1992, delivered at Florida International University, within the context of scientific socialism and anti-colonialism. I think it's important that we frame it within those terms because it's something that is a big debate within the left today. We have, on the one hand, first of all, let's define the terms, right? Scientific socialism. What is scientific socialism? So scientific socialism is an ideology, a theory that fights for socialism, where workers produce the wealth of society, they own the wealth of society. There is no surplus value, there is no imperialism and capitalism, there's no colonialism. And it's organized to meet the needs of the people and the masses and not a small class of capitalists. Now, throughout history, there have been different debates about how to achieve that. For example, anarchists, as Frederick Engels has famously critiqued, a lot of anarchists would be considered utopian socialists because their method of achieving socialism is not based on the real existing material conditions. They want to go to full communism right away. Communists and anarchists, we want to get to the same stateless class of society, but we disagree on how to get there in many ways. And so scientific socialism is a method of achieving socialism that is based on the real conditions, that is based on material reality, that is based on meeting the people where they're at today. And anti-colonialism, of course, we have to understand it within the context of the global South versus the global North. You have the United States, Canada, Europe, the settler state of Israel, Australia, and some would argue as well Japan, that constitutes the first world, that basically extracts wealth, resources, labor from the global South, Asia, Africa, Latin America, and continues to pillage those continents in order to extract more wealth for capitalism under the capitalist system. And obviously, anti-colonialism, as anti-colonialists, we favor the liberation of our people in the global South from that system. But however, within the anti-colonial movement, there are also some disagreements about how to do that. Some believe that we have to build capitalism, that we have to compete with, Western capitalism. Some believe that we should ignore Marx. Some people think Marx, Lenin, Engels, they're just old white dudes who have nothing at all to contribute, and that they're racist and stuff like that. Me personally, I'm somewhere in the middle. I don't think that scientific socialism and anti-colonialism are mutually exclusive. I think that, like Kwame Ture, and like we'll begin to hear in a little bit, he's able to synthesize, take the good from Marx, from Lenin, from Engels, apply it to the African context, apply it to the Latin American context, and to build socialism that is not just focused on class, but also on the liberation of oppressed nations. What do you think about that, Onyesonwu? Because I know that's something that a lot of people within the left today are debating.
I mean, I absolutely agree with in the middle. I feel like we have to absolutely look at the contributions of Marx, like dialectical materialism, absolutely is an essential tool for developing revolution. But I also think that one thing that Kwame Ture was really good about uplifting is that there was indigenous African revolutionaries that were pushing socialism as a solution to the condition of our people, as like the mechanism for which to achieve liberation in the anti-colonial struggle. So like, at the same time as we have Marx and Lenin, and we should learn from them, we also have folks like Kwame Nkrumah, Sekou Touré, Amilcar Cabral, Robert Sobukwe, who gave very strong contributions to the particularly African context that we find ourselves working in. So a lot of times those folks are erased because they're not Europeans, but they built upon Marx and Lenin and Engels and applied it to the specific context of African people. And they made indigenous African contributions to the struggle to build scientific socialism around the world.
Yeah, that's definitely right. And one of my favorite examples related to that is Haiti. I mean, you talk about the Haitian Revolution, 1804, one of the most important revolutions. And unfortunately, it only gets portrayed as a nationalist movement or just focused on the nation or like, anti-colonialism, which is good, of course. But it was also a class struggle because like 99.9% of those in Haiti at the time were oppressed Africans who were enslaved, colonized, and fought and won their freedom. And most of them were working class, people who were able to sustain themselves and live by the means of their own labor. They didn't own property. They didn't even have that bourgeois white conception of property relations. They worked in a collective way as a class. And so it was both a national liberation struggle and anti-colonial struggle, but also a class struggle. And so I think that's something that for me is really inspiring. Just some quick background on Kwame before we go into some of the clips. By the way, shout out to everybody in the chat right now. Shout out to Mac. Shout out to everybody who's listening and watching to Anticonquista. And again, shout out to the All African People's Revolutionary Party, Hood Communists, All African Women's Revolutionary Union. So Kwame Ture was, first of all, he was born, his given name was Stokely Carmichael. He was an organizer in the civil rights movement. He was actually born in Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean, but he grew up in the United States from the age of 11. And he became an activist as early as high school. He went to Bronx High School of Science. I actually applied to go to the high school. I didn't get in, unfortunately. I'm from New York, born and raised. But that's a good school. And Kwame Ture, from a young age, brilliant dude, man. I mean, you're talking about a genius who understood the social sciences, but also the natural sciences. And he was just a genius of his time. He was a key leader in the development of the Black Power movement. first leading the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and then as honorary prime minister of the Black Panther Party, and finally as a leader of the All African People's Revolutionary Party. He was so effective at building revolution and organizing the masses that the FBI targeted him as part of its COINTELPRO program, which targeted Black, Brown, Indigenous revolutionary communists in the US and destabilized them, attacked them, killed them. You know, we have countless victims of COINTELPRO. And Kwame, fortunately, was able to move to Africa in 1968, which I think is something beautiful. And I look at his move to Africa and his how he officially changed his name and he embraces African roots. And I think it's something so beautiful because you see the happiness in his face when he goes back. And he reestablished himself in Ghana and then later lived in Guinea in 1969. And there he adopted the name Kwame Ture and began campaigning internationally for a revolutionary socialist Pan-Africanism, which is a cutting-edge ideology that the U.S. ruling class does not want the masses to learn about. But that's exactly what we're going to be talking about today. Did I miss anything on Onyesonwu? I know I probably didn't do him enough justice, but I don't know if there's anything you want to add about Kwame.
That was very thorough. That was extremely thorough. Only other thing I'd add is, he was a member of the Central Committee of the PDG, which is the Revolutionary Party of Sékou Touré. And he was a revolutionary Pan-Africanist, committed Pan-Africanist. A lot of times people, particularly like petty bourgeois Africans and like the liberal media establishment, will frame his move to Africa as like a turn away from African people in the United States. But when he moved to Africa, he came back frequently to build the diaspora wing of the African People's Revolutionary Party, but also to build in poor working class African communities and historically Black community universities and all these places where African people were in the United States. So he by no means abandoned us when he went to Africa. He was building a global movement.
That's what's up. Cool. So let's go ahead and listen to the first clip from one of his speeches. Again, this is a speech from 1992 at Florida International University. He's talking about a wide range of topics, but some of these are mainly focused on action. How do we, as scientific socialists, but also as anti-colonial revolutionaries, understand reality? And this first clip, he's talking about common distortions about Marxism and people who attempt to compromise socialism with liberalism, and also talking about how as people who have a class analysis, we understand that nothing is neutral. You can't be like in the middle. You can't try to mend between two different classes. You're either for or against the people. So let's take a listen to this great speech. I'm going to pause it for a second because people are saying there's no sound, can't hear. Could you hear Onyesonwu?
No, I wasn't able to hear either.
No? Oh, shit. Okay. All right. That's weird. Okay. Give me one second. Can't hear. Could you? Okay. That's really odd. Well, anyway, in that clip, he was talking about how Marxism is something that it's not necessarily about so much focus on Marx himself, but more so on what he was trying to say, more so about his theory of classes, of the working class, the ruling class, and how capitalism divides people in terms of economic impact, in terms of exploiting, stealing wealth and resources from workers. And so I think, like, I see within the Latin American context, I see a lot of people who are pro-indigenous, who are pro-revolutionary, and unfortunately will a lot of times will attack Marx and say that he was like evil and he was horrible. But Kwame in that clip was talking about how, it's not necessarily like, don't just judge Marx himself, the person. Socialism is bigger than him. Anyone would have come to that same conclusion any part of the world. And so I think it's something that is really important for us to keep in mind. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I definitely agree. I've noticed that tendency within, the African liberation struggle, where there's like a certain segment that's like, anything, socialism is Eurocentric because Marx himself is European. And that has no application to the context of the national liberation struggle of our people, and that we have to make our own contributions to like the ideology that's going to liberate us. And that's because they're attributing way too much credit to Marx. I mean, obviously, like I said, like he contributed dialectical materialism. Like we have to acknowledge his contributions. We don't have to demonize him. And I feel like, to be honest, the demonization that happens of Marx is a part of the anti-communism that's like spread across society by imperialism and capitalism. And that's why people do it. But we also have to understand that he could not have possibly invented socialism as a concept. And that's one of the things that Kwame Ture points out. Like we call the law of gravity Newton's law, but we know for a fact that before Isaac Newton noticed that things tend to fall at a certain rate of force, that people otherwise are in other places noticed that before him. There's no possible way that couldn't have been the case when humanity existed for thousands of years before that European man noticed that particular force. So what Kwame Ture says is that although Marx is given credit for writing down these ideas that contributed to the development of socialism, before Marx wrote them down, other people, I guarantee you, in Africa and throughout the Western Hemisphere were observing precisely the same things about how capitalism functioned and why. And so when we say socialism is a science, when we say scientific socialism, it means it is a universal truth that belongs to all of humanity, not just one European man. We can acknowledge the contributions of that European man. We can integrate the unique contributions that he made into our development of our analysis. But we also have to understand that no one person can own the concept of socialism.
Yeah, most definitely. I think he had like one of the best political lines in terms of that, in terms of welding the two. So I realized, by the way, my fault for, I just realized what the issue is because I was playing it from my browser. And so the audio's not coming through. I'll figure that out next time, but let's keep talking about Kwame. I think that he's somebody in general that if you haven't read him, read his stuff, listen to his speeches. There's a ton of them on YouTube. And it's something that I listen to a lot when I'm working out, when I'm trying to get inspired, because a lot of times, like I'll listen to like Zizek and all these like European like leftists or whatever, and they're fucking boring. And I'm just like, it's like a snooze fest, And Kwame, like he reminds me a lot of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, because like the way he talks to people, he talks the way like we're talking now, right? He's not like, well, tonight, like he's speaking the way a working class person speaks, and I think that was some of the brilliance of Kwame. Onyesonwu, why don't you tell us a little bit about his political development, right? Because I know early on he was in SNCC, which is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which as we know today was kind of more on the reformist work within the system, nonviolent. What was his break like? What was his ideological break, and what exactly propelled that?
SNCC was actually a pretty radical organization. They were like distinct from like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which is like MLK's organization. Like they were like very far to the left of like the mainstream civil rights movement. And they were also internationalists. And though they were in the South organizing African people around the right to vote, organizing people to like fight for the vote, they weren't trying to register African people for the Democratic Party. They were trying to form independent African political organizations. And so having that be like one of Kwame Ture's earliest political homes was like a massive influence on how he developed politically, because they were like among they weren't in like Washington, D.C. trying to get a seat at the table. They were among the masses of poor and working class African people who were living under conditions of like European settler terror, who like when they went to go vote were getting like shot at and bombed and stuff. And so those were the conditions that SNCC was organizing under. So yeah, I would just like to say first that they weren't necessarily reformists. They were pretty radical. But so his like political development, I would say he started off almost like Black nationalist, precisely because of how SNCC was organizing in working class African communities. He was very much like in the book Black Power that he wrote with Charles Hamilton. You can kind of see what his early politics were. They were very similar to like the race first kind of folks that you see on Twitter, except he actually organized, where he was mostly like, we need to organize independently as African people amongst ourselves. We don't need to work with Europeans. We don't necessarily need to work even with non-African peoples until we have built a base of power that is independently African. At that time, he was skeptical of socialism for some of the reasons that we talked about earlier, like, the anti-communism in US society, but also like the perceived Eurocentricity of Marxism. But then as SNCC began to develop that internationalist analysis, they started moving towards a more anti-imperialist, more revolutionary socialist space. Some examples are when SNCC became the very first, one of the very first organizations in the United States to be anti-Zionist openly. And it was like an uproar. It was an uproar. Like European liberals were like horrified. Like
they were clutching their pearls.
Yes, exactly. They pulled funding from SNCC, refused to donate. A lot of them left SNCC before they were formally expelled because the African leadership was like, I need to get the fuck up out of here. So yeah, they were one of the first organizations to take an anti-Zionist position. And also, this is like little known, but SNCC traveled to Guinea. They were invited by Kwame Ture of the PDG to meet him and to talk about the African liberation struggle in the United States, and also to get support. Like a common line is that Africa has never shown up for civil rights struggles of Africans in the United States, and it's not true. SNCC met with Kwame Ture. They were invited and sent to Guinea and learned about revolutionary Pan-Africanism, learned about anti-imperialism, and that was another big push leftwards. And so you see, like very early on in Kwame Ture's organizing life, he had this anti-imperialist analysis developing, this internationalist analysis. And then SNCC, as they kept moving further left, built relations with the Black Panther Party. Ultimately, Kwame Ture attempted to like join the Black Panther Party and SNCC and become like a chairman, but because of the efforts of COINTELPRO, he was snitch jacketed. They accused him of being like, they put out like a messaging accusing him of being like an informant. And unfortunately, some members of the Black Panther Party, because of how thoroughly they've been infiltrated, like bought that, and it ultimately didn't work out, that merger. But after that is shortly when Kwame Ture traveled to Ghana and met Kwame Nkrumah, and then became kind of like, Kwame Nkrumah is like not agent, but like, what's the word I'm looking for? Like he was basically like sent, like Kwame Nkrumah gave him orders and he was like sent to build a diaspora Pan-African organization that would meet the call that Kwame Nkrumah raised in the Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare to build a global Pan-African organization to liberate Africa. So
that's what's
kind of a really cool trajectory.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think he has one of the coolest stories. Also, like Claudia Jones, who's also from Trinidad as well, has a cool story. She traveled everywhere. Kwame Ture, he was literally all over the African continent, the diaspora, the US, and he was able to understand the global context and the internationalism. Shout out to everybody in the chat, by the way. Shout out to Ian. Shout out to Comrade Erica. We spoke with her a few weeks back about Malcolm X. Make sure to follow her work, Liberation Through Reading. Great stuff out there. Shout out to Henry Hayes. Shout out to Max. Shout out to James. And again, my fault. I couldn't play the clips. That's my fault. I fucked up. But we're going to keep talking about Kwame and his significance, because I think Kwame would have a lot to say about today. You know, we have Sleepy Joe Biden, this predator, pedophile, everything, you name it, everything that's horrible about Biden, racist, right, segregationist, like everything about him is horrible. What do you think Kwame would say about the push by the Democrats to try to win Black voters for Biden? You know, what do you think Kwame would say about that today?
I think about this all the time because I see so many petty bourgeois African misleaders calling for compromise, calling for strategy. And I just feel like he would be like, this is a bunch of bullshit. Like, y'all are very clearly selling out. This man is a racist. We're not. Why would we work with this openly racist pedophile segregationist? Like, I feel like Kwame Ture would expose these people so clearly. Like, there's no real, like, there's no leader that had his platform that still exists today that's willing to call out the capitulation and the compromise that's happening, the opportunism that's happening. Like, people are able to just like openly, like, did you hear that audio of the meeting with Joe Biden where he's talking to so-called civil rights leaders?
Oh, I think I did, yeah.
What? Like, he's just like disrespecting them, like telling them like, you're not gonna, you better stop this, defund this police shit. They ask him for like certain hires and he's like, no, and he like yelling at them, and they just like take it. They're just like quiet. I'm like, oh my God, like this now, like, these are the people who are supposed to be leading the struggle for our liberation in the mainstream, and they were just like just disrespected to their faces by this racist European man and had nothing to say. And I feel like Kwame would call it out explicitly.
Yeah, definitely. And it's so disgusting to see the Democrats and the liberals, how they're able to try to win over people in oppressed communities and use them as tokens for the election and immediately drop them. And that's something Kwame Ture spoke about a lot, something that Malcolm X spoke about as well, is like the danger of reformism. And I think one of the most interesting aspects about Kwame Ture is that he called it like it is, right? He wasn't like, oh, let's heal America, let's make it better. He understood that at its core, the United States is a settler, colonial, imperialist, capitalist hellhole empire, and the liberation of African people and other oppressed peoples around the world will only come about by tearing down this empire and replacing it with something new, because it's kind of like trying to build a house. It's like if you have a house and the walls are rotting, and instead of just tearing down the walls and building a new house, you're just painting over the walls and painting over the mold and being like, everything's going to be cool, because that shit's going to come back and collapse the house at some point and collapse. And so I think it's something that he correctly pointed out. What were some of his biggest international acts of solidarity? I know he was definitely someone who was a fan of Fidel Castro from Cuba. He was a fan of Vietnam, the Vietnamese people resisting imperialism and French colonialism. What are some other comments that he has made in solidarity with people around the world who are also fighting against colonialism?
There was one, actually, in the speech, there's one moment where he's talking about the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and where he's like, I called up Saddam Hussein, and I said, I'm on your side. And the audience was like shook, because that's like a very principled anti-imperialist position that is very rare within the left of the United States. One thing that the AP-PRP and Kwame Ture did consistently is like raise an understanding that the beast as people within the U.S. empire, when the U.S. empire is in the process of attacking another nation, regardless of whether or not that nation is perfectly revolutionary, that is not the time to raise your critiques or to say, like, let's have conditional solidarity. Like, the U.S. empire is the most dangerous and violent force for evil that has ever existed in the history of the planet. That is not exaggeration. And so to say, like, this at this particular moment, when the U.S. is attacking another nation, this is the time to raise my criticisms, which is like the consistent behavior on the left of the United States, like, that makes no sense whatsoever. And Kwame Ture was a person who understood very clearly who the primary enemy was and what that meant for us living in the snake. So that was a consistent position, whether it be for Libya, like Gaddafi's been was demonized for decades, whether it be for Cuba, whether it be for Vietnam, whether it be for Guinea-Bissau, whether it be for Guinea. Ture was called a dictator, and the AP-PRP never waived in terms of supporting the sovereignty of Guinea. So this is a consistent position of both Kwame Ture and AP-PRP.
That's so true, and even like, it's so true. Erica also mentions it as well on social media a lot. I'm glad she calls it out, the lack of internationalism. And so many times people in the U.S., I'm glad AAPRP is able to stand firm on a line and principles, even if it's not trendy, because it's not trendy to defend DPRK. It's not trendy to defend Syria or Zimbabwe, or, you know, and it's just like, as revolutionaries, you have to understand that what is the correct position. Even if the masses in the first row don't agree with you, it's still correct to defend these countries from colonialism and imperialism, regardless of whatever critiques you have. And at the end of the day, that's part of self-determination. It's like, let the people decide, like, who are we to be like, oh, well, I don't like the way Mugabe does this. I'm like, dude, I don't live in Zimbabwe. Like, how the fuck am I going to go and tell people how they should or should not be doing stuff? And just the arrogance. And even Camilo, shout out to Camilo in the chat, by the way. Shout out to Comrade Yamir. I think you know Yamir as well. Onyesonwu.
Yeah, we got a TV together. Yes.
So yeah, shout out to Venceremos Brigade. They're doing some really great work, bringing youth out to Cuba. And Camilo had a good comment. He said, the liberals' annoying use of identity politics to preserve capitalism and imperialism. We recently saw the appointment of a black man to one of the head positions of defense in the U.S. by the Biden administration. What do you think, and what do you think Kwame would say about that as well?
Yeah, he was appointed Secretary of Defense, and I saw immediately petty bourgeois African people, the liberals, being like, "This is a big win for us. What important symbolism!" But all it really means is that the U.S. empire, along with preparing to antagonize China militarily, is also planning to expand its military footprint in Africa, and having an African man as the face of that is going to be advantageous for them. So I feel like people have to, instead of like falling for the liberal logic of embracing symbolism, just like pure symbolism, we have to look like scientifically at what is actually happening. The U.S. military has 46 U.S. military bases in Africa. It has thousands of troops. It has a very clear plan to compete with China for control of African resources, and having an African man as the face of that work is going to make it a lot easier for them to accomplish that. Just how they used Barack Obama, like that is when AFRICOM expanded the most drastically, was during the administration of Barack Obama, because his identity allowed them to do that. I feel like there needs to be broader understanding of what neocolonialism actually is and how they use that symbolism against us.
Yeah, and even especially with Obama too. I mean, you talk about like our home countries like Honduras, black and brown people who, after the coup d'état, the right-wing coup d'état by Obama, that were hardest hit. You know, the areas on the coastline of Honduras today that belong to the Garifuna people and other indigenous Afro-indigenous peoples are being privatized, they're being sold, people are being killed. There's still 5 comrades who are disappeared and haven't been heard from. And that the government that's in place now is because of Obama. And like you said, you know, Obama carried out the invasion of Libya. He expanded AFRICOM's president. And it just seems like the imperialists love to use identity politics as a way to try to galvanize support for imperialism. And it's kind of connected to what we're talking about with Kwame Ture and scientific socialism and anti-colonialism, because I feel like part of the new strategy by the imperialists is to separate the two, right? Like they, like for example, like in Nicaragua after the Sandinista revolution, the U.S. imperialists started trying to get indigenous people in the U.S. to try to create anti-Sandinista propaganda to say that the Sandinistas were oppressing the Miskito people, which like a lot of that information was pretty like if you look at it closely, a lot of that information was very inaccurate, and they were using that identity to attack like countries that were liberating themselves from colonialism. And with socialists, like, you know, they uplift voices like Jacobin or the kind of the white Eurocentric left that gets money from some really questionable places, but they don't want to connect scientific socialism and anti-colonialism because it's exactly what Kwame Ture is talking about. And what do you see? Do you feel like more people in the US are becoming aware of like combining these two? Like you can be a socialist and anti-colonial at the same time, or do you think like we're kind of getting to a place where people are trying to divide it more?
I think they're definitely coming closer together in people's understandings. And the reason for that is because of the very obvious class contradictions that exist within colonized communities, including the African community. Like we have mayors like Keisha Lance Bottoms in Atlanta, an African woman who is enabling gentrification, who is directing police to engage in acts of brutal violence against folks fighting for social justice in the streets. And that's the case in like majority African cities all over the United States. Folks are very clearly able to see that despite the fact that these folks are telling us they're on our side because they look like us, they are enabling the system that's oppressing us. And so even though we share an identity, like something is off. And so people are starting to peep the class contradictions. And there's still that nationalist consciousness. There's still that understanding that we are an oppressed people, a colonized people. And so I really think that just like the way that the African petty bourgeois has like shown its entire ass is like exposing itself to the masses of the people and making it clear that it's both a class and anti-colonial struggle.
Yeah, and the same thing kind of like with, I think Biden appointed some right-wing Cuban gusano as the head of like Homeland Security or something. And it's, you know, they're like, oh, he's Latino, but it's like, okay, he's a white settler who, you know, probably owned a lot of suspicious stuff in Cuba and now heads his department and is locking up Black, brown, indigenous people at the border. And the optics of it are just insane. And for me, it's just disgusting to see the way that so many people fall for it. But I think you're right. I think people are becoming more aware of it. I think people are opening their eyes to the limits of identity politics and why it's important to combine a class-based analysis of society with anti-colonialism. For example, like Palestinian liberation and Puerto Rican liberation is also class struggle, because most of the people who are under the boot of colonialism in Palestine and Puerto Rico are working class people. And it's the same all over the world. And I think that within like the Trotskyist white left, they would critique those as like, that's just bourgeois nationalist movements. Those are just like fighting for nationalism, without really understanding that most of those people were working class people. Shout out to everybody in the chat. He said that dude's fam had like a steel wool company or something like that. Yeah, I mean, he probably had a lot more than that in Cuba. I don't even want to say, but it's just disgusting to see that. Going on a little bit more about Kwame, what were some of the ideological framework of AAPRP? We know that your party is one that, comes out of that legacy of Kwame Ture. What makes AAPRP different from other organizations? Hold on, let me.
Sorry, I muted myself and then I couldn't find the tab. Sorry.
Yeah,
So we have our own revolutionary ideology. We're not Marxist-Leninist.
Yeah.
We're not Maoist. We are Nkrumahs Tureans, meaning Kwame Nkrumah and Sekou Touré are the primary ideologues that developed the political analysis of the All-African People's Revolutionary Party. We are a mass-based political party as opposed to, say, like a vanguard party, meaning that we understand that the most significant and most impactful revolutionary movements of African people have happened on a mass basis. And so the organizations that make up a part of the All-African People's Revolutionary Party, like the PDG, like the PIGC, like the PAC, they're all mass organizations. The PIGC, for example, has like millions of people in it. So that's one specific distinct component of our ideology. Other components are the idea of a revolutionary African personality, the idea of forming like a new kind of African person, because we understand that when colonization came, when capitalism was spread across the world through imperialism, it created like a submissive, kind of like separated from context African person, particularly in the diaspora that was like individualistic. This is like an intentional strategy, right? To ensure our passivity, to ensure free access to our labor and resources. And so the idea of a new revolutionary African person is to develop an African person who returns to our collective sense of identity and liberation, which returns to a collective understanding of what freedom looks like. It's an idea of an African person who puts the masses of our people first, as opposed to ourselves first. It's the idea of a revolutionary African person who is like humanistic, who is principled. So we're seeking to not just, wage a class and anti-colonial struggle, but also to transform the ways that we relate to each other, the ways that we relate to the land, the ways that we relate to ourselves. So yeah.
And Africa has the potential to be the most powerful continent in the world if it comes together as unified, and is the imperialists and the capitalists are kicked out. I mean, you talk about the stuff that Gaddafi was planning to do in Libya with the huge irrigation dams and creating an African currency and unifying the continent. It's so inspirational. And I think that's one of the coolest elements about, I think, like AAPRP, Kwame Ture, and others, is that they had a internationalist perspective also within Africa, because a lot of times like people get stuck within these labels, right? They're like, oh, like it happens in Latin America too, but like I'm sure on the African continent as well, people be like, oh, well, I'm Ghana, I'm Nigeria, I'm South Africa. And they only understand things within the prism of that little carved out space that was made by colonizers anyways, and they're unable to move past that and create new formations, larger states. It happens in Latin America as well, where people are like, oh, well, I'm Brazilian, so I'm only going to focus on Brazilian stuff. I'm only going to focus on that. What do you think Kwame would say about that as well?
It's micronationalism. I feel like he'd say the only difference between us is a boat stop, because everybody in the prep says that.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's micronationalism, right? Because like, first of all, especially in Africa, but like throughout the world, like these nations that we're identifying as, we didn't like create those nations. We didn't create those borders. Like we didn't choose that. There was actually completely different borders in the Western Hemisphere and in Africa before European colonization. So the idea that I'm for example, would be like, I'm Honduran. Like the people, the indigenous people on the land in Honduras did not call that place Honduras. Those are not the borders they had. So like identifying with this construct created by imperialism makes no sense whatsoever. But beyond that, like, I feel like if we examine the conditions of African people throughout the world, we're going to see very similar things in context after context after context. We're going to be exploited. We're going to be pushed out of the formal economy. We're going to be over-policed and dehumanized and criminalized. We're going to be overrepresented in prisons. Like these are similar conditions no matter where we exist, including on our own land in Africa. And there's a reason for that. Pan-Africanism provides the analysis that explains why, no matter where an African person exists, it's very likely they're going to be subjected to the same kind of oppression. Whereas if you're just like, I'm from Baltimore and I'm just going to deal with the very specific context of Baltimore and not deal with anything else outside of that, you're only going to get to a certain level of analysis. You're only going to get to a certain level of intervention. And the overall issues, the underlying issues for why African people are oppressed are never going to be dealt with. So yeah, it's micronationalism and it's not liberatory.
Most definitely. And it's the best way to control, it's divide and conquer, right? Keep people divided into the little fiefdoms, keep them easier to control, even though the same people, but it's so easy to control. One thing that a lot of times people say is like, socialism has never worked anywhere it's been tried. They say that socialism is utopian. They say that it goes against human nature, right? That's the common thing. Like greed is human nature, so capitalism is the right thing. What would and the slogan of AP-PRP, part of it is like one united socialist Africa, right? I probably didn't say it exactly right, but some more along the lines of like a united socialist Africa, which is something that for Anti-Conquista as well, like we promote that, a united socialist Latin America. What would a socialist united Africa look like? What are some immediate steps that the people would do in order to construct socialism in Africa?
We would abolish those colonial borders, which I already said, we did not create those borders. Oftentimes they like split nations in half. And then that created like a lot of like what people refer to as like ethnic conflict in Africa was a direct result of imperialist intervention. So no more colonial borders, collective and democratic control of the wealth of Africa and the resources of Africa. So a very important thing to understand is that Africa is the most resource-rich landmass on the face of the planet. We also have the youngest and fastest growing labor force on the face of the planet. And despite the wealth that exists in Africa, African people are desperately poor because it's the capitalist system that is stealing that wealth. Companies like Tesla, Microsoft, Google, Apple, stealing resources openly from Africa, exploiting African people's labor. So one of the first things that a Pan-African socialist continental government would do would be to ensure collective ownership of those resources, of the means of production, so that they can be used to advance the well-being of the masses of African people, and also so they can be withdrawn from the capitalist imperialist system, which will be a death blow to that system. So those are the two main things. Also repatriation for people in the African diaspora, so letting it be known that if you're an African person anywhere in the world, you are welcome in Africa. You are a citizen of the African nation.
That's beautiful. That's something and it would bring, because it's like, as human beings, like our biggest strength is human labor, and that's part of like what scientific socialism is about, right? That's why there's the 5-pointed star. It's like the 5 fingers of the hand. Labor advances humanity. Because of human labor, when we collectively work together, we're able to achieve a lot of beautiful things. And just imagine the power of a united socialist Africa with the repatriation of Africans from all over the world. Even something, for example, in the area of music, like African music is the most, in my opinion, like one of the most popular, widely listened to. When we're talking about hip hop, we're talking about anything. So even in Latin America, right? Soca, merengue, salsa, punta, like everything is based from Africa, and so much wealth that would be under the control of united socialist Africa would be beautiful to see. And I think another thing that would be beautiful to see as well in the united socialist Africa is also the ability to give people the chance to participate in their own labor in terms of doing agricultural work or also city work, the ability for people to, because there's enough resources on the continent for everybody to survive, for everybody to live, to grow. It's just that these countries are forced to pay reparations to the imperialists. They're forced to basically give up all their resources to multinational companies. Everything will be owned back for the people. One thing that I wanted to ask you, what critique do you have for people because we were talking about earlier about utopian socialism, right? The difference between utopian socialism and scientific socialism, that a lot, especially in the anarchist movement, unfortunately, who are more utopian socialists, they view anything that's construction oriented, like people building, small businesses or people building like infrastructure. They don't really see that as socialism. And like, what response do you have for people like that who don't really appreciate? Because, for example, like somewhere like Honduras or Africa or Latin American countries where there is no infrastructure, there is no things for the people. People want a good standard of living. People want peace, stability, roads, buildings. What critique would you offer to utopian socialists who say that all of that is just capitalism?
It just doesn't make any sense, and I feel like it's a very first world analysis. It's from someone who is used to having running water in their house and living off a road that's paved. Because if you go to Africa, if you go to the global south, what you're going to find is people living in shipping containers, like a whole family, with no running water, with no consistent electricity. So if the expectation is that if we win socialism within that society, we're not going to build the infrastructure required for people to have basic utilities, then that's ludicrous to me. And also it's a way to like employ people. And also it's a way to develop their autonomy, to develop their level of organization. I feel like you have to deal with the underdevelopment that imperialism and capitalism have created. And there is a socialist means of doing that. There is a means of doing that respects the planet and that respects non-human life. But to say that it can't be done because it's capitalist is just not dealing with reality.
The homie Yamir has a good question. He asked, what do you think Kwame Ture would think about the 2018 Marvel movie Black Panther and how Africa gets portrayed in the movie?
I think that he would say that it is very tragic that a monarchy, an isolationist monarchy, is being upheld as some kind of model for however people aspire to. Man, I hate that movie.
Yeah, what'd you think about Black Panther?
Ooh, oh my God. So like, first of all, the premise, right, is that they had like this mineral that came from space, and instead of sharing that resource with the rest of the African continent, they decided to hoard it to themselves and hide, and then just sit back and watch as Africa was conquered by imperialism. And then when they decide hundreds of years later not to be isolationists, their first move is to work with a CIA agent, which they would have, like, if they sat back and watched what happened to the rest of Africa, they would know precisely what the CIA was responsible for. So they work with the CIA agent. And they also went to the UN. And I was just like, who wrote this shit? Like, it's so frustrating. It's so frustrating because it's revisionist history. Because Marvel, first of all, works with the Department of Defense, works really closely with the US State Department, with the US imperialist apparatus to present a specific form of politics. So it's intentional because they know that the masses of African people, the masses of people in general, do not understand how negative a force the CIA and UN have been in Africa. And so they are taking advantage of that ignorance to rewrite history and to frame them as the heroes. And that is extremely dangerous because to this day, the CIA and the UN are attacking the cause of African liberation, are attacking African people, period. So to have them framed as the hero in a movie that's being sold to us is like something for us, like something to make us feel good, is like very, like, it makes me very angry. When that movie came out, I was very upset.
Yeah, and it's like a way, it's like a controlled release. Like, it's a way to, like, because that stuff, it's interesting because if you think about it on the surface level, it's beautiful to think about, like, okay, like a united Africa that's developed skyscrapers, and you have like a powerful group of people who are developing the continent. But then, like, the imperialists subvert it, right? Because that's how a lot of propaganda works, right? Like, they identify like what's on people's minds, right? A lot of people are like, yo, Africa has a potential to be like the biggest world power. We have all this like resources, natural wealth. but then they subvert it, and that's kind of like they subvert it with like, okay, you're going to work for the CIA, you're going to collaborate with the UN, you're going to be controlled by the white imperialists. And so it's like a way to identify what the masses want, but then bring it back to imperialism. And it's kind of the same thing with the Democratic Party. We're talking about earlier that Kwame Ture was critiquing the Democratic Party. It's like they identify like, okay, and people, black people, brown people, they want more rights in the US. They want to not live in a racist society. They identify that, but then they realize how to control it, how to taper it down, water it down, and control it. And I think that's something that I'm sure Kwame would have a lot to say about today.
Yeah, like we talked about earlier, SNCC was registering African people to vote. Like the very first organizing experiences that Kwame Ture had were registering African people to vote in the Deep South. But SNCC was not registering African people to vote for the Democratic Party. And there's a point in that video where Kwame Ture says, I have never voted for any Democratic Party candidate. This is a man who was instrumental in the movement to get African people to vote in the United States. And he was like, I have never voted for a Democrat. But now in 2020, the narrative is that African people fought and died and bled for the right to vote for Democrats, that voting for Democrats is like the highest expression of our so-called power. And it's just very like, it's a rewriting of history. It's a rewriting of history. SNCC never ever registered African people for the right to vote. SNCC registered African people for the right to vote for Democrats. SNCC registered African people for the right to vote so they could build their own independent political organizations. And all of the organizations that Kwame Ture was ever a member of are all independent African organizations.
I also meant to ask you, do you know if Kwame Ture ever spoke about or wrote about Marcus Garvey? And if so, what was his analysis of Marcus Garvey? Because I know there's some debates as well within the left, about Marcus Garvey. What did Kwame have to say, if anything, about Marcus?
So there's debates about Marcus Garvey in the left, but there's no debate about Marcus Garvey in the African left. We are clear about his contributions. But like,
I like
so
Marcus Garvey. Yeah.
Yes, me too. Yeah. So like in the speech, actually, someone I believe asked Kwame Ture about his thoughts on Marcus Garvey, and he's like, we have to this day, Marcus Garvey helped build the largest working class-based African organization that has ever existed, the United Negro Improvement Association. He re-centered Africa in terms of our understanding of the African liberation struggle. He built a sense of pride. He helped instill African people with a sense of pride at a time just after the end of slavery, where we were at our lowest in terms of our conception of ourselves, in terms of our understanding of ourselves as an African people. So like in terms of like the development of revolutionary African nationalism, of Pan-Africanism, you cannot separate Garvey from the development of that politic, despite the fact that they were not necessarily like scientific socialists. They were still focused on building a collective base of power that was revolutionary nationalist and anti-colonial for African people. So like, yeah, I've seen European leftists say wild things about Marcus Garvey. Someone hopped on one of our posts and called him a fascist. I was like, I've been around the wrong African people if you feel bold enough to say that to us. Like if someone says anything about Marcus Garvey in front of me, they're gonna hear about it. But yeah, it's an indication of how marginalized and attacked revolutionary nationalist African politics are, that people are so comfortable disrespecting Marcus Garvey despite his obvious contributions. And I feel like Kwame Ture would say similar things.
That's so well said. And shout out to Erica in the chat. She said, Black political power, say that, rise up. Facts. Yeah, I mean, to be 100% real with you, like I'm one of the, like, that's one of the things, like I said, right, where I'm kind of like in between. Obviously, I'm a communist. I support scientific socialism and I support anti-colonialism. I'm a fan of Marx and Lenin, but I'm also a fan of Garvey. I like Garvey. And I've gotten so much shit from white leftists, even unfortunately some non-white leftists who are like, oh, Marcus Garvey was like a Nazi. Like someone tried to call him a Nazi or some shit. I'm like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, and he, I think like the contributions, like you said, have to be understood within the context of his time, because he was organizing and serving his people at a time that not only was it dangerous, but it was a different political moment. And I feel like so many times, like especially in the first world in the West, people have this understanding of like they have this checklist. They're like, oh, did this revolutionary do this or say this? You know, and they're like, oh, he didn't. Okay, he's horrible. And it's just like, what advice would you give for people who are like studying African history, African revolutionaries, and have these preconceived notions of people? You know, how do we understand them within the context of their time?
I feel like you have to almost like compartmentalize, right? Because we have to understand that we live in a context that is extremely hostile into anti-imperialist politics and also extremely hostile to communist politics. And so anything that has even like a whiff of that is going to be demonized in such a way that it's going to be so constant that you're not going to realize you've internalized it. And so you have to understand that what you don't know. You have to understand like what you've been steeped in, and then you have to engage the ideas in this history on its own basis instead of like bringing in the influence of imperialism, if that makes sense. And that's like really hard to do. But yeah, I just kind of feel like people have a particular analysis of anti-colonial movements that presumes they have to be socialist at the gate, but understanding how imperialism works to steal resources, to exploit labor around the world, any movement of a colonized people, regardless of whether or not it's socialist, to end that exploitative relationship is positive. So even if an anti-colonial movement is like bourgeois nationalists, to be frank, if they are seeking to separate from the colonizer, if they are seeking indigenous control of resources and labor, that's still positive. Like, it's still positive. And so on that basis, it should be supported, because the ultimate enemy to be taken out is imperialism. And the more colonized peoples and nations that like sever that exploitative, that parasitic relationship, the weaker that enemy is going to be for all of us to take it out together.
Yeah, and Comrade Yamir had a good comment in the chat. He said Ho Chi Minh was influenced by Garvey. That's exactly right. I mean, Ho Chi Minh, when he started off, he was actually like more of a nationalist, like more focused on, in that realm, national liberation against the French colonialism. And it's interesting. Ho Chi Minh is really fascinating because, you know, you're talking about a poor working class Vietnamese guy visits France and he sees the bullshit of the French Communist Party. How, okay, like they were on the socialist side, they were saying all the right things about worker versus boss. But once you start talking about like African colonies, Southeast Asian colonies, they're like, whoa, 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 whoa. They're like total right wingers. And I think that Ho Chi Minh was able to understand that people like Garvey had a progressive role, that they helped serve the people, even if they weren't, quote unquote, fully communist, that they were still progressive leaders because, like you said, they were materially challenging imperialism in the real world. It's kind of like, I have the same thing with Iran. Like, for example, a lot of, you know, we, Anti-Conquista, a lot of us, we are in solidarity with the people of Iran against US imperialism and sanctions. And it's like, their system is built for them, right? They know what they want. That's part of their national sovereignty, their national liberation. Sure, you know, for example, like I'm an atheist, I'm not religious. They're more on the religious side, but whatever, like the primary contradiction is imperialism. But unfortunately, so many people in the first world, especially white first world leftists, who are just like, oh, they're a religious theocracy. They're just a nationalist movement. And it's really something that unfortunately is very prevalent. We just have about 3 minutes left, but Onyesonwu, why don't you tell us a little bit about some of the work that you're involved with the All African People's Revolutionary Party and how your party is carrying out the legacy of Kwame Ture?
So we are a propaganda party at this point in time. First and foremost, we engage in political education work across various formats to raise the consciousness of our people. African people are fed a steady diet of lies about our history, about ourselves, about Africa. There is intensive work that has been done to attempt to separate African people in the United States from the continent, to make us antagonistic to Africans and the rest of the diaspora. And so the work of the AP-PRP in this particular point in time is to be like, look, we are African people. We are colonized people. Our destiny is not tied to the future of the US empire. Our destiny is tied to the future of Africa. And if we unite to liberate Africa, it's going to improve our material conditions and our political conditions in a way that engaging in politics in the US empire never will. So we do that on our website. We do that with our weekly program, which you are always in the comments in, weekly Pan-African news every Thursday at 12 p.m. Mountain Time. We do different deep dive into political education topic. We also work in close coalition with African liberation organizations on the continent, like the Pan-African Congress of Azania, like the PDG, like the PIGC. But we also work to build strong ties with other anti-imperialist movements of colonized peoples, like the Indigenous National Liberation Struggle. We work closely with the American Indian Movement and Pueblo Action Alliance. We also work with the Filipino National Liberation Movement, like organizations like Gabriela and the Chicano National Liberation Movement, etc. We're working to build ties transnationally amongst African organizations, but also with anti-imperialist organizations, period. And then also we do lots of anti-imperialist organizing in terms of like Cuba solidarity work and Venezuela solidarity work. That is why I'm on the National Coordinating Committee of the Venceremos Brigade. So we are deeply focused on providing political education on a mass basis that is accessible for our people. And in addition to that, we do community defense work because we understand that capitalism is collapsing and African people are about to get the brunt of it. And we cannot hope for the capitalist system to save our people. So we must organize to build independent African institutions to meet the material needs of our people and to prepare them to struggle and win.
That's what's up. I'm so glad to hear all of that. Honestly, the AP-PRP is like, for me, one of the parties that's like on the cutting edge of both theory and practice. It's advancing in the 21st century. It's not just like LARPing in the past, playing dress up. They're actually doing serious work, helping the people. And again, to everybody watching and listening, my fault, I couldn't get the clips right. I fucked up. Next time I'll fix that. But we have someone from the actual party that Kwame Ture was a part of and a major leader of. And I think Comrade Onyesonwu, you did an excellent job at summing up Kwame's contributions, both in theory and practice. He's hands down one of my favorite communists, and more people really need to study and learn from him. Go check out his speeches on YouTube. There's plenty of them. And also make sure to go and follow AAPRP on social media. Make sure to go and follow Hood Communists as well. Shout out to Hood Communists. Shout out to Erica in the chat. Shout out to everybody here. Onyesonwu, thanks again. We got to have you back on for sure. And I hope you have a great day.
You too. Thanks for having me.
Cool.